Welcome, everyone, to the Brandon Adams podcast. This is episode 30. I have with me Tom Dwan and Nate Silver.
Hey, guys. Hey, audience.
Very excited to learn that on this podcast, we're going to be talking about not only Nate's new book, but also possibly a little cryptocurrency, which is known to 10x any audience size. So, Nate, to summarize the conversation before we went on, you had a book, The Signal and the Noise, which sold a huge number of copies. Are you able to tell us roughly how many copies that book sold?
I think it's in the mid six figures, which for a book is a lot. Like books, if you sell like 10,000 books, then that's actually kind of a lot, right? So if you're selling in the six figures, then the publisher is usually very happy about that. So that was good.
The Signal and the Noise is a modern classic. I take it that you were given a lot of freedom to basically pursue whatever you wanted. You had a chapter on earthquakes. You had a lot of fascinating new material in there. How long did it take you to write The Signal and the Noise all in?
So it took about 4 years, out of which I'd say probably a quarter of my bandwidth was spent on the book, right? So like, Whoa. It took about a year's worth of work, I'd say. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, a book is a hard thing to do, and it's something that you kind of your mind gets totally absorbed in. But the thing is, like, I need like big projects to work on, or I kind of go stir crazy, right? And usually it's like an election model I'm building or an election itself, but like my brain needs like something to it's goal driven, I think, or I just I mean, you know, I'll sleep well and exercise more, so that stuff's good, but it's just kind of the way I function. So, but no, so this, I guess I can't formally quite announce this new book yet because we haven't signed the contract yet, but I've been encouraged, had encouraging conversations with my agent, my publisher, and have a strong inkling for the direction I want to go with the second book here.
So I guess we maybe can't talk about the specifics on the part that's going
to. Well, I mean, at this point, I guess we're kind of like, but like.
I was just going to tease it and say what I've heard. I hope you end up writing the book you told me.
Yeah, why don't you say what you heard? Yeah. But it would be a book that would cover a lot of the subjects that people who listen to this podcast are interested in. So, you know, poker, sports betting. I mean, it's basically be a book about gambling and risk, which is a big spectrum of things, especially you're defining gambling rather broadly, right? Saying gambling is not just things that happen in a casino, but also a lot of investment, a lot of trading is at least gambling adjacent. Maybe looking at things like how did people handle the COVID pandemic? Clearly, like risk communication, risk management, right, is kind of a challenge for people society-wide. But yeah, it's like one of these topics where when you start to think about it, it runs really deep, right? Like how much of risk is embedded in capitalism, how much does it vary among different societies and stuff like that, right? So it's all these kind of fun things that when you start on a book, you start to think about. Do not have very many answers yet. I have a whole bunch of people, including the two of you, that I'll want to talk to and hit up for other contacts. But yeah, and it's also partly like partly autobiographical in in some ways, right? You know, I had a period of time where like I played as a limit hold'em online grinder in like 04 through 06, and like that's actually kind of an important part of how I was able to quit my corporate consulting job and start doing things I actually wanted to do, like found 538, for example. But I still kind of think like a poker player in a lot of ways, and I think it's kind of the way that frankly I think people in this kind of world think, and I'm not quite sure what to call the world, but it differs certainly from when you go into the world of like political journalism and you kind of feel like a fish out of water sometimes. And so it's kind of like trying to like explain, you know, what's it mean when you have a probabilistic forecast is one kind of fairly important, but, you know, limited example, but also like, you know, why do people who gamble for a living tend to be a little bit distrusting of the conventional wisdom, a little bit contrarian at times, right? I mean, there are reasons for that having to do with, you know, you don't want to just accept the market price on something. You're trying to look for flaws in how people think, right? So kind of the more I kind of think about myself, I think about what are the idiosyncratic characteristics that I have that you kind of get in the normal world, people think are either different or they don't entirely understand. It comes down to a certain way of thinking that you tend to gain if you're kind of making bets for a living, whether on poker or investments or on crypto or whatever else. That's a basic. I've now totally spoiled any mystery here. The book has not been sold yet, right? It's a proposal that I'm working on that my publisher and agency I'm excited by. So yeah.
I have an idea for your book launch. I need to talk to your publisher.
Okay.
For your book launch, it's sort of like the promo for a heavyweight title fight. We need to get you in a debate with Nassim Taleb where you guys actually come to blows.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's because part of, I guess, ironically, is part of what the book is going to talk about is kind of skin in the game, right? I don't know if he kind of considers me someone who has skin in the game. I don't know if he actually knows that, like, I kind of what my background was and stuff like that. But like, but it is going to make a distinction, I think, between like people who actually have to, develop or are playing poker or kind of making bets for themselves, right? And are kind of making decisions for themselves versus like maybe a more academic statistics background, right? Because like in the election realm, I'll sometimes get in like little fights and rivalries with people who are trying to build election models and have like not actually ever like gambled for a living. And you just kind of learn like a lot of street smarts if you do like actually kind of have to back your bet with your own money. I know that sounds stupid and it is kind of getting repetitive with like skin in the game, right? But like, you develop a very kind of practical sense of estimation. You get a very practical sense of like, here is something in the model that like, I just think kind of looks wrong. And I'm not going to be super duper idealistic about kind of, I don't know, but you recognize that like kind of model building is like an inexact kind of dirty science in a way. But you also kind of think deeply about kind of the underlying mathematics behind it. And I don't know, does that make any sense?
It does to me, yeah. So if you zoom out like and try to look at kind of a lot of academia, a lot of the financial world that's not trading dependent, I think a lot of the institutions in the world don't really value guessing that much, academia more than most even. And 20 or 30 years ago, I think that was pretty reasonable. We were still kind of trying to figure everything out. But effectively now, if you zoom out and look at most fields, computers are just better than people in most areas other than error checking and guessing.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times people who took a lot of wagers that were consequential, for example, poker, where they got to see results, they started having a better ability to guess than a lot of other people. Meaning in poker, you might have 50 or 100 guesses throughout the day. And so one thing, I might have said this on your podcast, Brandon, I don't know, but I don't know. One thing I've like told a bunch of people when they ask me about poker is basically if you went to one of the higher games in a casino, one of the decent sized games online, and you asked someone if they made any mistakes in the last few hours, a lot of people would say no. But if you went to the highest game in the casino, the highest games online, people would say they made 5 mistakes in the last 4 hours, kind of thing, because they're guessing at like, oh wait, maybe I could have figured out that I shouldn't have done this because this guy's making this mistake. And I think that's a skill that was not valued as much as maybe it should have been, whatever, the last few decades. But as computers have gotten better and better at replacing humans in a lot of areas, I think that's becoming more and more important. Basically, if you're not either prioritizing guessing or error catching, or you're an athlete or something, what's to stop a computer coming for your job in the next few decades?
No, and I think to study, I'm sure, Tom, that you are looking at solvers a lot or not as much, but
I don't look at them as much as most poker players, partly because I'm generally not trying to focus on the games where everyone's using solvers already, because then it's not as fun, not as much money. But yeah, you still need to some. To me, the area I think is more interesting currently to look at for this is sports. That basically in sports, you used to have a handicapper, but they still needed a model, and the model was maybe 10 or 20% of the problem. Now you have the models are maybe 80 or 90% of the problem, but you still do need people overlooking and sometimes saying, we're missing a lot of these. We don't really know why, but maybe it's this, and COVID was a great example of that.
Yeah.
That a lot of people's models flailed at first, because we were just living in a different world from a sports gambling perspective than we had been for the last few decades. It was the first pandemic.
No, I think people don't, it's kind of the 80-20 heuristic, right? You kind of like get 80% of the way there with your model, but the remaining 20% is really quite important, right? To say like, when is something clearly outside of bounds of the model, right? Like in our election forecast for 2020, my view was that there was kind of more uncertainty because of COVID. And there were kind of various strategies for trying to quantify that and kind of bake that into the model, but like a global pandemic that we haven't seen for 100 years, which directly affects the mechanics of how you would vote, for example, seemed outside of the scope of a model trained on election data over the past 40 years or whatever, right? And so kind of having that judgment, knowing when a bet that your model recommends reflects like a faulty input, right? That can happen like a fair bit. Just kind of knowing, and because you can also obviously overdo it. I mean, you want to develop like good heuristics and you want to follow them most of the time. But yeah, there's a lot I could talk about with like with like COVID policy, right? But like one thing that's been weird about that is like trying to create approximations that are supposed to work for everyone when people have like kind of vastly different risk tolerances and different priorities and stuff like that, right? But that's a whole different story. But no, this is kind of the skin of the game stuff, I think, right? It's like, when can you kind of catch that that mistake that you're making? Also, like kind of, what parts of the problem are rewarding if you spend more time on them and which ones aren't, right? I mean, sometimes if I'm building a model, I'll get like obsessed with some like elegant mathematical feature and really spend a lot of days writing better code around it, right? And you kind of stress test and you're like, this actually doesn't matter at all, right? It makes the probability 78.5 instead of 78.2, and it's kind of interesting mathematically, but like I should spend more time on aspect X, right? I'm sure if you're studying poker, some things are fairly trivial and some aren't, right? People can get very caught up in trying to worry about some hand they play where it's probably part of a mixed strategy anyway, right? But yeah.
Yeah, if you look at like sports, for example, if you have soccer where there's 11 players on the field, the model is solving for a lot more of the answer, as opposed to baseball where the pitcher is so important, but even then you have more and more games, so models are solving for more answers or a higher piece of the answer compared to something like UFC, where, it's a very, very high variance, quick ending, one person versus one person spot. I don't know. I think it's an interesting problem to think about and look at, of like basically these places to assess risk. And one thing I think is really, of the stuff you did that I think is really interesting to talk about, is 2016. How I don't really see 2016 as a significant mistake or anything that you guys made. It's like, okay, probably in hindsight you had the chances of Trump winning a little bit low, but you guys had it, I think 35% or something going in. And it's kind of like, yeah, inherently no one's going to be perfect. This was your guess. Your guess was pretty reasonable. And if you look at New York Times guess, which was like 97 or 98%, that's just objectively ridiculous.
Well, and to me, the betting markets were at like 18%. So you would have bet under Kelly criterion actually quite a bit on Trump using our model. And so, so to me, that's like an example of where obviously like, that's how I think about it, right? I thought that like, and I kind of said publicly, no one listened, right? But I kind of said like on Twitter and stuff that I think intellectually it'd be better for our model if Trump wins, right? That would be a better validation of the way we're doing it. Because it was also kind of like the thesis that our model had was the reasons that he won, right? Because there's high correlation between different states, because he's overperforming the electoral college, because there are a lot of undecided voters, and that creates more uncertainty, right? So, obviously kind of that experience, it was, I guess not surprising to see kind of that's not how most of the world thinks about stuff, right? But we had also gotten like, I know I'm like, I've been very lucky in my life, so I hate like sounding like I'm complaining or anything, right? But like, we got like a lot of critiques before the election in 2016 for being too bullish on Trump, right? Democrats were like, no, he can't really have a 30% chance or whatever it was. It fluctuated between, between almost 50 at some points and 15, and but in that range, right? And people like just couldn't accept that like somehow this goofball reality TV star could beat the presumptive next president, Hillary Clinton, right? So, I mean, I think politics is unique in kind of like melting people's brains a little bit. In terms of like people like not, people see things through a very partisan lens, obviously. That's not like breaking any news. But I don't think they realize how much that affects their perception. Like the polls that per se are not partisan instruments, right? Per se, you could say, I really want the Democrat to win, but I can recognize the Republicans up by 5 points in the state, right? But it really kind of warps people's perceptions.
Yeah, anyone who was following 538 predictions in 2016 was betting on Trump. So for me, that was a clear predictive win.
You remember, Brandon, we were in London during Brexit, like the day of the Brexit vote?
Yeah, that was fun. That was some pretty insane betting action, pretty insane swings.
I didn't have any bets on Brexit, but I remember talking to you when Brexit happened and saying, I think the chance of Trump winning is higher than I would have priced in yesterday or whatever, It's because both of them were a bit of a like lashing out at kind of the consensus wisdom at elite, this kind of I think there was, I don't know what you can call that, like a somewhat of a rebellious vote or whatever in both of those things against the kind of established political class. And I think people have now solved for that quite well in the last few years and understand a bit of what happened, why a lot of models got it wrong, why a lot of supposed experts got it wrong on both Brexit and Trump. But I think that's something that'd be better if you start having an idea of before those things happen in the future.
I mean, Brexit was this fairly direct parallel to Trump, right? And by the way, Trump also, we were bullish on Trump relative to the market in the general election in 2016. We were not in the primary. So we deserve being skeptical, critics were being skeptical about Trump winning the GOP primary. But you have these warnings, right? He won the primary and people did not expect him to, and then Brexit happened. And so it was kind of shocking that people were so shocked by this same kind of theme happening again in the general election in 2016. I mean, it's really kind of weird, but like people don't like uncertainty is part of it, right? Like in years where 538 would have a model and we'd say, okay, the conventional wisdom is that Obama's a slight favorite over Mitt Romney, but actually he's a pretty heavy favorite. Like people understood that and they appreciated that product a lot, right? When you're telling people, most political news consumers, even if 538 related content, are partisans and they're reading the information because they are rooting for one candidate or the other, right? And probably more of our readers are Democrats, right? They don't like the message that actually this outcome is less certain than you think. Yes, Clinton is favored, but it's actually kind of close, right? That kind of is not what people are looking to hear, or at least what they were not looking to hear in 2016. Post 2016, all of a sudden, Democrats are a lot more sympathetic to hearing about uncertainty, and they don't want overconfidence or whatnot. But
do you have an estimate of which presidential election was the most heavily bet? Because on a high stakes poker a few months ago at the table, we were debating how much might have been bet on the 2020 election, and the estimates were in the range of 15 billion. But 2012 was a very, very highly bet election. 2016 had some heavy betting action. I'm not sure which is the winner. It's one of those three elections.
I think it might have been. I mean, there was a lot of slightly weird and interesting market action in 2012. I don't know if it was like organized campaigns, like kind of buy up.
That was proven, right? Like that, or
Yeah.
at least like academics have written papers where they strongly believe that there was betting action on Romney for the purpose of influencing public opinion, right? I'm not going out on a limb with that.
No, I think it was demonstrated. Yeah. And also 2012. Remember, that's an election where like Romney's an old school Republican that probably is, you know, good for business, quote unquote, and good for Wall Street, right? So you kind of have like, direct financial interest to hedge against that outcome. Whereas with Trump, I mean, it's kind of unclear, I would think, kind of what's good for quote unquote the market, Biden or Trump winning.
But I've never seen someone bet for the purpose of it, hedging. Like people, the logical hedge would be to bet against Romney if you were very pro business or you had a lot at stake in terms of in terms of business interests, and that's not what was happening. You just had.
Yeah, I've never really heard of people doing that on the presidential election. Like people hedge in other ways, but the presidential election, they just bet who they want to win. That's everything I've ever heard.
You should hedge, right? You're like, if you wanted Biden to win, right, you should have said, I'm going to bet Trump at 2-1 for 100K, right? So if Trump wins and I'll be sad, but at least I'll have $200,000 or something. But yeah.
So you think there's a chance that 2012 was the most highly bet election in terms of cumulative volumes?
I would bet on 2012 being, especially inflation adjusted, if that matters, being the highest volume.
Yeah, I would pick 2020. I mean, I'm not sure. But I didn't know that thing about 2012. I just know.
Are we counting the post-election period in 2020? Because 2012 was over that night, right? 2020, you still had market action for for much longer than there really was any doubt, I think. And election night, you had a huge amount of volatility. Yeah.
Well, Betfair, let's just say, accounts for most of the post-election activity, and Betfair maybe is 10% of the total, Tom? I don't know.
I have no idea. No, I mean, there was like some of the US sports books had, and then the one crypto site that I just did a podcast with the guy, they had also, which that was a funny thing. Their price on Trump was like 2.5x the price of Betfair, even though, I mean, I think they traded a few hundred million, and Betfair traded more than that. And it's kind of weird to have such a big, Betfair had Trump like 4 to 5%, and FTX had him like 9 or 10%, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, this is something I'm gonna have to research for the book and try to do some actual understanding. There's various theories tossed around about like, I don't know, like people wanting to cash out their bets because different sites weren't paying out. I don't know. I mean, I think like an element was that like there was some degree of actual crazy in the market, or I don't know. I don't want to, I mean, again, in a year and a half from now, we have another podcast and I'll be more knowledgeable about exactly why
I think there's strong evidence that bettors have hyperbolic discounting. They have extreme time preference. For instance, like on Betfair or other exchanges, it's not uncommon for like the game to be over, but there will be action at the 1.01 price because there's always someone offering like 1.01 after the event is finished, just in case someone wants to cash out before the market is settled, like someone is that impatient. And there always is action at that level because like there's some person who just wants to put the money in place straight away and they'll just cash out for that VIG. So there's evidence in other markets of extreme hyperbolic discounting, extreme impatience. That it could well have been that simple.
I mean, maybe, but it was like 1.09 or something, right? And I mean, that seems like it's a pretty big price to pay. I don't know.
Well, Betfair was like 1.0405. FTX
was
like 1.09.
Yeah.
I mean, they did theirs different. They had like a Trump coin, so it was like 9%, but effectively like 1.09 on Betfair.
So speaking of crypto world, Nate, you highlighted that you might have some chapters on crypto, NFTs. I'm curious, are you going to go into the finance realm at all? Because that's its own black hole. You could get lost there for some time debating market efficiency or market inefficiency. So do you intend to wade in those waters? How much will there be on crypto NFTs? Because, okay, I thought when Tom came up in poker, I thought Tom may be the biggest gambler of his generation, and it was a generation that gambled pretty heavily. This new generation in crypto, younger than us, just absolutely gambles their faces off. Like, they put our generation to shame. Is that fair to say, Tom? Like, they're putting you to shame as a gambler, which is really saying something.
So yeah, you're like literally ticking off different chapters, right? I mean, there has to be a chapter, I think, on like hedge funds and venture capital firms and kind of proper investing, right? We have to tackle like crypto and NFTs, maybe even kind of the traditional like art market as an interesting little triad if you're going from NFTs into that, right? So these are all areas that like I'm super interested in. I mean, the book's going to start with like a heavy focus on like poker and sports betting because like those are things that I know personally, and that is going to give things like a really solid foundation, I hope. And like I'm probably guilty of too often using like poker and sports analogies in my writing, but like in this book, we're kind of encouraging that, I think. But yeah, it's going to start by like demonstrating hopefully a really thorough kind of up close and personal understanding of these things where I do have skin in the game as someone who's kind of builds models myself, and then I have to become more of like a reporter for the rest of the book and interview people and learn about things. But I hope that like, I mean, one thing is like the bar I think is somewhat low in the sense that like usually when journalists write about any of these topics, right, it's kind of grossly oversimplified. It usually kind of moralizes a lot, or it kind of mystifies too much, right? It says, oh, this person is some super genius and like we'll never understand his or her gifts, right? And so kind of trying to demystify these things, to understand some of the, kind of moral and other ambiguities behind them. I mean, it does seem to me that like people are just going nuts for any type of gambling or gambling adjacent activity, right? I don't know if it's something because of like because of COVID, where people just kind of needed more risk in their life to kind of supplement I don't know if it's a reaction to boredom or whatever else, right? Because you saw lots of behavior during COVID, like people like speeding increased a lot. People driving cars and motorcycles too fast, right? Heavy consumption of alcohol and drugs increased a lot. Lighting fireworks increased a lot, right? But kind of thrill-seeking, kind of risk-seeking behavior, I think maybe going to last.
Tom, how would you explain this generation? Because a lot of the crypto space and the NFT space is driven by like under 35, under 30. And maybe they don't have the net worth that the older generation has, but they have so much risk tolerance that they punch greater than their weight in markets. How would you explain the extreme risk tolerance of the younger generation?
I don't think I have a good answer for that. It's something I've thought about, but I don't have a clear, like, I have some guesses. That's about it.
It's almost like gamification of the markets, right? Because this generation came up with games and on screens, and there has been a certain gamification of all markets.
I mean, maybe it reflects like affluence in a way. I don't know, right? Because one theory I have that probably will not hold up, right? But like, because supposedly poker players from Sweden and Northern Europe are like, I mean, they're kind of crazy and aggressive by stereotype. And it's like the most affluent societies in the history of mankind, basically, with a huge the luxury of having a welfare state to protect you if things go wrong. I don't know, right? That's one theory. Or maybe it's boredom. and kind of if society feels as though it lacks risk, that you somehow have a human need to compensate for that somehow. I don't know. I'm gonna like talk to like, find some evolutionary biologists and people like that and talk about kind of evolutionarily kind of, is risk taking something that you'd be selecting for or selecting out, under what circumstances, and how has that kind of evolved over time?
One thing that's seemingly unique about the crypto space is,
I want to jump back on that one but okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Take it, Tom.
So it depends what kind of society you live in. If you live in an authoritarian society, risk taking will evolve out pretty quickly, because the people that take risks are a threat to the state or the king or whatever, and so they'll be killed. And so if you look at history, or sorry, cultures that have throughout history had a more authoritarian society, often those cultures want to take less risks in certain ways, but then that'll weirdly sometimes result in them taking more risks in other ways. So I think it depends a lot on like, the evolution of people over the last few thousand years, like where if you were in some place between a bunch of different somewhat powerful different kings or whatever in Europe or something, maybe risk taking was good because you ended up carving out your little space, right? But if you were sitting in China and there's one emperor for a lot of the time, then risk taking probably was going to result in your bloodline being stamped out.
Cross-national surveys of risk tolerance, although the results when I saw them were not super intuitive. So I don't know if that means my intuitions are wrong and biased, or if the survey is is weird. But yeah, but there is attempts to quantify this.
People also have different risk tolerance for different things, right? So different cultures may have more risk tolerance for gambling, but less for skydiving, and more for certain, so I think a lot of times those things aren't easy to put one figure on. I think sometimes you might need a few figures, like a few different answers depending on what kind of risk. I don't know, yeah. And like the Brexit and Trump stuff, I think both of those were people lashing out because they didn't really feel heard. So they were willing to take risks that a lot of the world thought were crazy. A lot of their countries, a lot of people outside their country or their space thought was crazy. But they were sitting there not feeling heard, and they're like, okay, let's gamble. Like, no,
I think you would explicitly kind of hear that from some segment of voters. Like, it's like, well, why not take a chance? I mean, they would use that verbiage, right? Usually, like, usually people don't use that verbiage when talking about about a political candidate they would choose, right? But people would say, "I'll take a chance on Trump. What's the worst that could happen?"
That might be something to model for the future. When you get enough of those, your uncertainty has to start going down, or going up. I mean, sorry, like meaning enough of that kind of, that kind of vote of people feeling like they have no other choice. I think that becomes very hard to quantify then what they're going to do from there.
You mentioned that you would have a chapter on the traditional art market. I think there are similarities between the traditional art market and the NFT market, because in the traditional art market, you really don't have many exits on the investment side, right? You have demands bidding up marginal price, and then people assuming that the marginal price is indicative of the value of all art, but you rarely have sales, really. There's not a tremendously active market. If you look at most individual collectors, they either buy and never sell, or they buy and then get them appraised and gift them away or something like that. In NFTs, we're at a very interesting time in the market where clearly new demand translates into higher marginal price, and it makes everyone feel good that the value of their holdings is high, but there's not much selling that's going on, and you don't really know how successful one has been until they have the demonstrated cash on cash return. It's one of the beauties of poker and sports, is that you deal in instantaneous cash transactions and you know your cash on cash return. And stuff like NFTs, seemingly they've done unbelievably well, but there aren't a lot of people cashing out.
I mean, there may actually be similarities to like,
yeah, but like the market for professional sports franchises may have some similarities in certain ways, but I don't know. I mean, all this stuff is like, if I look back at like the topic outline I had for Signal when I kind of started writing that, a lot of things I had sketched out wound up being very wrong. My kind of uneducated conception of them versus kind of when you spend a lot of time reporting and talking to people and learning about stuff. But yeah.
You bring a unique voice to thinking about risk, and this book is going to be a unique perspective. Who do you think are the best original thinkers on the subject of risk markets?
It's not people in in the political world, I don't think. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like I have had like very big rivalries with Taleb, right? But I think especially his kind of first two books, he's at least kind of thinking about the stuff in ways that are original and interesting. I mean, I think some of the behavioral economics literature is useful here. I'm always a big fan of Kahneman. I'm a big fan of like Dick Thaler. I think Michael Lewis is someone who understands these things and is one of the kind of better people at kind of being able to get in the head of how someone in one of these fields might think. I don't know. I mean, it was kind of really interesting to see like, Maria Konikova's book, The Biggest Bluff, because she's kind of coming from the opposite direction, right? She's writing for the New Yorker, writing kind of lots of great books about science and kind of like plunging in and trying to learn poker and becoming extremely good in a short period of time. But kind of that's a fascinating book to read.
I knew that would be a big success when she sent the advance copy, and I read it the night I received it. It was just so smoothly written. You could tell that it would find a wide audience. She did a great service to poker.
What's her book mainly about? Poker?
Her experience in poker over a 2+ year period, learning from Eric Seidel. I don't remember you making an appearance in there, Tom. There was some Lucky Chewy content. There was a good bit of Patrick Antonius content. There was some Galfon content, but she definitely mentioned your name a couple of times, but
I think one thing that's interesting with risk is like, so I was just talking to some friends about this. Do you guys know this stuff happening right now with in Russia where they're like moving a lot of troops around, and there's a lot of people are worried they're about, this looks like past times they were aggressive.
Not familiar.
Also, the last like week or two, that's been happening a bit.
Don't give away any state secrets that you learned in poker games. We know that happens sometimes.
No, this is all public information, but it's something that's not being talked about that much. And like, I wish there was a market on it of like, what's the chance Russia tries to redefine some borders? One, to see that and see like where the market would price it. But two, I think that this kind of like betting on these kind of events, inherently, if something like that was going to happen, there would need to be a lot of people that have an idea of it, and trying to get that info from those people, there's a lot of issues with, right? Because that would be like, someone trying to get effectively like Russian classified info of like, oh, they're about to go in and, redefine some borders somewhere. But if those people could just bet and make basically guaranteed money, if you made it frictionless enough that they didn't need to give their ID and stuff, and like a lot of these crypto political betting markets are like that, I think you'd start noticing a lot of times, we would have guessed with this information this is 10%, but the market's pricing at 50%. I wonder what the chances are.
This comes up a lot, right? Like for a tennis match or like a MMA fight, like an individual sport, especially where something seems like it's mispriced, you're like, oh, do people have inside information? You can kind of go back and forth between assuming there must be some inside information here and convincing yourself, and sometimes it isn't true, right? I mean, I know in like political betting markets, like we would often like because I work for, 530, it's part of ABC News, right? So I do not, by the way, bet in political betting markets myself. That would be all types of ethical violations of my contract with ABC. But there are lots of times when we have had early knowledge of some political development or some poll, and the markets don't pick up on it generally, even though there are probably hundreds of journalists who have the same information.
But what do you think the net worth is of those average people? Because I would guess it's less than the net worth of a bunch of the people that would need to know if Russia was going to redefine some borders or a lot of these other geopolitical things.
The journalists are making upper middle class incomes generally.
Right. I think there's ways to solve for that in some some prediction markets that would be really interesting. And I don't know. I think there's a lot of those random kind of world events that people assume one kind of common wisdom. And, if you look before Crimea as an example, people assumed, international borders are international borders. It would be cool if there was something like that solved for. And I think that might come in the next decade or two, that these kind of random things start getting solved for. I mean, one example is Brexit, which those kind of things there are markets on. But I think the more you start having markets on obscure things that have real world impact, meaning if, say, 3 or 4 years out, you somehow seeded a market on who are the next presidential candidates going to be, I think you'd start seeing a bunch of interesting results. Where right now, if people have a really good inside track on who's going to win, who they think is going to win the Republican nomination and why, okay, this person's good at these certain things, they have this skill set. What are they going to do with that information, right? There's not a real way to profit on it a lot. But if you set that up, you start getting really interesting.
Whatever happened to Augur? That was supposed to be Augur's role, right? The betting market for everything, like the Betfair of the crypto space. It never developed as promised, right?
Yeah. So after the presidential election, I think it was Augur. There was Augur, Omen, and then there's Polymarket. And Augur was the one I think that because they wanted to resolve things in a decentralized way, which doesn't really make sense. A lot of the kind of decentralized ethos in crypto makes sense, but having a third party completely decentralized, what they call Oracle, to resolve prediction markets just inherently doesn't really work, because you can have a situation like Trump's election where Trump says, no, actually I won. And then people are like, well, we're holding the Trump coin. What if we just vote and attack the Oracle and say Trump won?
Yeah.
And that was a big concern on Augur, that people were worried it was going to resolve as if Trump had won the election. Yeah. So obviously if there's a Brandon Adams, prediction market site, if Nate and I were betting on there, we wouldn't be worried that you're just going to randomly say Trump won, because if that happens, the value of your business goes close to zero overnight, right? But if you have a decentralized system and enough money's bet on one certain event, maybe they're going to attack the system as a whole just to resolve that, because those people have different interests than the system as a whole.
Yeah, Augur had a lot of promise. It's sort of shocking that it has fallen flat. It's proven very hard for betting markets to gain liquidity in general, right? Betfair had a long ride. They started as Flutter.com in 1999, I think, with lots of funding, and it took many years for them to have liquidity. It's harder than you would think to get very liquid markets on stuff like elections and even sports.
Well, I think you need to seed them, be willing to lose little bits on a bunch of different interesting markets. Like the thing I was saying of, if we were to go put up a market on what's the chance Russia tries to redefine some borders, or what's the chance, whatever random world event that's interesting, you're going to lose some money if you give some tens of thousands in liquidity, because you're either going to have people who know the market better than you, or people that actually have inside information on something. But if you do those things a few times, I think that's amazing advertising for a prediction market.
Yeah, sports, the fact that inside information is not illegal in sports does make them stronger predictive markets, because the reason markets are efficient in general is because consensus estimates tend to be more powerful than any individual's estimate. Consensus filters out any idiosyncratic error in individual estimates. And then market prices tend to be an even stronger form of that, where at the extreme, one person who's fully informed can completely determine price. So one person who knew for sure that Russia was going to invade, they could like fully determine the price. And so we think that betting markets should be extremely predictive. And if you're going for max predictive power, then you actually want inside information to be legal and possible, because you just want that information unveiled quickly.
Well, and I don't think you want inside information legal and possible in most areas, because that hurts financial markets. It hurts, a lot of these things. But and even in sports, I don't think inside information is that important of a piece in a lot of different sports, because athletes are paid a lot. There's a lot of incentives to not have info leak too much.
No, but simple information like whether key players on the NBA slate are going to play tonight. There's so much market incentive in knowing that information before other people that they're not markets I'm involved in, but there are people that would like work super hard to get that information quickly and have it reflected in market prices.
Right, but the NBA makes a lot of money, and it's in their interest to not have that leak. And they can have the people that would have that information be making really large amounts of money. So there are ways to somewhat control for that. It's more when you have information that a lot of people may have that's valuable and they don't have significant amounts of money. Then there's like an inherent arb if you can figure out how to solve for it, right? If everyone who has certain information is making 500K plus a year, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get that information. You need much more upside. You need more, but if there's a bunch of people who have valuable information that are making 10K a year.
So some low-ranking member in the Russian army or something,
or in the NBA, it's like the beat reporters, right? Like there's always someone who's low paid.
And that's just one example I brought up. I think there also was something interesting with like the Trump and Brexit stuff of people wanting change, wanting to be heard. I think there's some, I don't have it myself, but there's some interesting things to solve for there of kind of collective wisdom when people's conviction is higher and stuff. And, if you look at the example of the election or Brexit, the conventional wisdom of a lot of experts had certain flaws because those experts shared a similar bubble,
I mean, in Brexit, there was a very clear bias for like a cosmopolitan worldview, right? Because the polls showed Brexit being basically a dead heat. People kind of misremember this now, but they showed, maybe if you had a polling-based model, it'd be 55-45 Remain. And the market was like 85-15 Remain or something, right? It was completely off kilter from
the day of. It was even more.
Yeah, I mean, and that was just because, we know the British people are sensible, and my friends will, they wouldn't really leave the European Union. I've become very pro-Brexit now, by the way, because of like how much better the vaccine situation is in the UK than the EU. Like they're literally going to avoid an entire whatever third or fourth wave it is that the EU is experiencing solely because of like having superior policy with respect to vaccines. And so that seems like it might outweigh a lot of other consequences potentially. But yeah.
Yeah, I had thought Brexit, like, I'm not British. I do go there a bit, but I thought it wasn't in the best interest of the UK. And my conviction on that is definitely a lot less high now than it was a few years ago. Like, there's definitely some interesting, benefits that have come to the UK from Brexit, that being one of the biggest or clearest ones, at least I should say.
So Nate, you've been a big fan over the years of Philip Tetlock and some of his thinking on prediction. He has his long-term project on super forecasters, and he takes the view that you can sort of do better weighting the opinions of super forecasters than you can just weighting a global average of opinions.
What's a super forecaster?
It's almost like a professional forecaster, someone who spends all of their time in forecasting. Nate, perhaps you could explain it a little better, but it's a group of people that are dedicated forecasters and have proven themselves to be better forecasters than the general public. So I believe that Tetlock, he basically allows anyone to submit forecast for a range of things. And there's some very mild incentive to be a good forecaster, but it's mainly pride. And he has a group of people that have over a long period of time submitted better forecasts, and they are his super forecasters. And they tend to be persistent outperformers.
I mean, I buy Tetlock's research with a little bit of a spin, which is I think it's probably true that like people who study like the meta META part of forecasting, right, treat it like its own discipline or become frankly good estimators, which is a skill that overlaps with poker and sports betting, right? I buy there's a learnable skill there. But I think the real headline for Tetlock is not that the super forecasters are so good, but that the experts are so bad in their own fields. That domain experts are often like quite bad at prediction. And I think part of the reason why is like has to do with like professional incentives and the nature of how expertise is perceived. You know what I mean? Like if you're like Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about COVID, you probably are like extremely constrained in what you can say. You also have the issue that like you might actually influence people's behavior, what states do about COVID and how individual people behave. And so that becomes like kind of more complicated, but like, but you know, the minute that your incentive as an expert is to maintain your reputation as an expert and whatever good that does for society if you're Dr. Fauci, or whatever income stream that provides if you work for like some fund or something, right? That's a pretty strong perversion from the incentive to like kind of have the most accurate prediction. And so, you know, like a lot of epidemiologists on Twitter or public health people on Twitter will kind of make a prediction about, oh, COVID cases are going to rise or decline or whatever, right? To like advocate for a particular policy. We have to shut down indoor dining or something, right? And they're like policy advocacy may be in the right place, but like, but kind of start with the conclusion and then kind of make a forecast to justify it, not the other way around, at least some of the time, right? Where if you're not an epidemiologist, no one's asking you for your opinion about should we close restaurants, then maybe you can be a little bit more at arm's length and able to kind of actually focus on like predicting how this thing will behave and not trying to dictate policy or moralize or affect people's behavior or whatnot.
I think there's also an issue sometimes where people that are experts in a field will land too much in the policy area and not stay in their lane enough. And I'm a pretty big Fauci fan myself, but I would give a pretty strong criticism of him on the mask stuff. Yeah. That in March, and I think even some of April 2020, he was saying people shouldn't go buy masks, and masks weren't, didn't help. And I know I was actually in Asia at the time, I'm in Hong Kong, and assumed that he was right. And everyone there kind of knew he was wrong. He explained the science of why he was wrong, and I was wearing a mask when in the West people were talking about, oh, these masks don't help. And the science was they do help, and the scientists knew they did help, but they were like, oh, we need to save them for the doctors. But the issue is once you effectively lie once, like I think I can look back and say, okay, Fauci, you effectively lied. Wish you hadn't done that. You were probably under a lot of stress. Still like the guy a lot, would like to have a beer with him, think he did a great job overall. Yeah. But if someone was sitting there in June or July, they might have looked at Fauci's advice, been like, well, he lied that one time, maybe he's lying this time. Screw it. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. And it makes it a little easier for people to ignore something when in reality, it's probably like, oh, he was under a lot of pressure. He didn't mean to tell a mistruth or, I think look at it a certain way. And I think that happens a lot, where someone who's an expert in their area goes a bit outside their lane. And, I use this as an example of someone who's an expert that I really like, that I think most people really like. And even he, I think, went a little outside his lane in that one spot. And I do think it cost some.
No, I mean, first of all, the tendency for like the news media to try to treat people as being oracular, right? And kind of not recognizing what their lane is. I mean, I got this a lot, like kind of after I kind of blew up a lot in like 2008, 2012. People want you to like predict things that like you have no particular qualification. They put like way too much weight on things where you don't have expertise, frankly. But at the same time, like, I think the public health field did kind of not recognize that like COVID's a repeated game in a game theory sense. Like, people are going to like look at what you said last time and how credible that was, and then they're going to like adjust their behavior accordingly. Even like all these like blue states, right? When like state epidemiologists were saying, hey, look, it's too early to open up restaurants, right? Just wait another month or two, which I think is, probably supported by the science, right? The governors just ignore that and like, fuck it, we're going to open restaurants because they're going down. It's been a year. And it's because like there had been like too much kind of noble lying, quote unquote, taking place. You're trying to nudge people in the right direction, and you figure like it's okay to fudge a little bit, but like people figure that out after a year, especially a year where like they have to make like a lot of like day-to-day decisions. And I don't know. I mean, one thing we always try to do at like 538, and I try and do in the book, or we'll try and do in the previous book and the new book, is just kind of treat people as intelligent. Like, don't be too prescriptive. Like, to me, it's like with the CDC guidance that comes out. Okay, the important part to me is that you get a vaccine, and once you're fully vaccinated, then it reduces risk of getting symptomatic COVID by 95% and transmission by probably 80 to 90% or something, and death by 99% or something, right? And like, I can like make those adjustments on my own to my behavior, right? I don't need you to give me like a playbook for like now what I can do. I kind of have some sense for myself, right?
Right.
But the prescriptive nature of it, which kind of, doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I think kind of tends to get people in trouble.
There might be someone who's an expert that you want them to tell you what are these facts. And I think too often those experts, especially when the news media gets involved, are pushed to say, okay, and now what should someone do with those facts? Where you might, people might be curious what your opinion is of what they should do, but they care, or they value that a little less than your opinion of what are the actual facts of the polling data, or what are, for a doctor, what are the actual facts of the epidemiology? They may still care about the opinion, but it's like, they don't want it to be treated the exact same.
No, it's I mean, so often you read stuff like, okay, well, COVID cases are increasing in Massachusetts according to my analysis, right? That means we have to shut down X, Y, and Z again. It's like, okay, just stop with the first sentence, right? Because your expertise, which I could not replicate, comes in understanding epidemiological data and being able to be able to predict a trend better than the average person does, right? The question of kind of behavioral changes is kind of a intrinsically political question that you may not be the only expert in, right? If you're looking at, for example, should we shut down schools, then okay. I also want to talk to like child development people about kind of what impact that would have, or teachers or educators, or parents, right? The whole notion of expertise has been kind of, I think, it's been challenging under under COVID. And of course, there's a lot of turf wars over who is entitled to speak over what, right? And invariably, it's like not on the questions that actually are the kind of purely scientific questions. It's about the political questions where lots of people do have the right to to weigh in, right? Or do not just have the right, but they have like different expertise that's relevant, right? Where people want to police their domain a lot more.
I think it's a shame the stuff that happened in a lot of the West with COVID, where if you look back, about the worst possible thing to do was a lot of reasonably half-assed lockdowns. And what happened was a lot of reasonably half-assed lockdowns. And, like Sweden, which didn't have that, Florida, which had less of it, the numbers aren't that much different. It was like, you should definitely protect the retirement homes and things like that. There were probably some public health measures that could have been done around that. But also you can look at a place like Australia that said, we're going to have very, very strict lockdowns, and they were able to control you know, and it seems like the somewhat half-assed lockdowns, like, sure, you politically might look a little better in the short term, but then people get worn out. They don't listen to future advice, you know?
I mean, there's a kind of cheap poker analogy, which is like, it's a kind of a raise fold spot, right? And people, a lot of time, bad poker players will kind of call in a spot where there are two challenging options, right? And they'll kind of pick a half-ass in between. But no, it's absolutely right. The best thing you could do on COVID, if you did Australia and successfully pulled off zero or near zero COVID, clearly that's the nuts, right? But the second best play might be to do Sweden and not the US or something, right? Where you avoid a little bit of mortality for, well, maybe the US is better than Europe, or I don't know, but yeah, you avoid like a little bit of mortality for like a lot less.
The US is going to be better than Europe because of the vaccines, you know?
With the vaccines, yeah. I mean, it's hard to know. Like, I think people it's worth noting that like almost all major countries in Europe and North America kind of fucked up roughly equally badly, with the exception of like Germany and Canada, and like Norway, I think. But like a lot of different governments with different value systems kind of wound up in the same fairly difficult place. But I know, I mean, you spend a lot more time in Asia. Like, to me, it's like, you know, among other things, COVID's like a huge argument for like bullishness on like something is happening that's clearly working well in Asia. I don't know. I mean, I guess, right?
I mean, I think there's people follow rules more generally in Asia, but I also think there was a little bit more effective messaging, and a lot of the West seemed to not want to say like, I guess we should learn from Taiwan and Hong Kong at least. You know, I could understand them not saying we want to learn from China. The data's opaque. You don't know how much you can trust, these kind of things. But
yeah,
you could look at Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, somewhat like places that had reasonable outbreaks, and they were able to control it pretty well and be like, oh, let's learn some from them. And that didn't really happen. And I know I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm, you know, really not much of a Trump fan. A lot of that's public already. But a lot of people blame Trump for all of this. And I do definitely think he could have done a much better job. But there's a point that, like, look at how many other countries had pretty similar, you know, societies and stuff in the West, and had a similar problem to the one the US did. Like, you kind of can't pin that all on Trump. Does he deserve some blame? Sure, probably. But, you know, I think there's like a bigger issue.
I mean, the problem is like, if your primary tool is lockdowns, right? Then like people will only be willing to do a certain amount of lockdowns for a certain length of time, and they're kind of a very like costly intervention, right? So you have to like eventually, you know, do the South Korea stuff, like the testing and the tracing and the quarantine, and maybe give up a little bit of privacy, right? But that's what surprised me. I kind of thought, well, it's so clear that like all these people dying from COVID is unacceptable, and that lockdowns are incredibly cumbersome and costly if they happen over more than a period of a few weeks, right? These alternatives are so awful that we'll have to somehow evolve toward like South Korea or Taiwanese strategies, because it's like just so much better than either alternative, right? And somehow we didn't, but neither did like most other kind of Western or American countries.
I think that's your opinion, and not everyone shared that opinion. That, you know, some people didn't necessarily believe the downsides, and didn't necessarily believe that the country should be shut down, even if those downsides were true. And I think that was like a political discussion that should have happened, that never really did.
I mean, that's one thing I think Trump did make very difficult, right? I think he kind of like poisoned the discussion about schools, because a lot of Democrats were like, I mean, Democrats are supposed to be the party that cares about education, right? But like opinion was very partisan on schools, which is a very difficult issue based on people polarizing around Trump, and that shifted a little bit more once Biden took office. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my big kind of critique of COVID policy is people aren't pricing in the cost of like lockdowns properly. It's like hard to measure, right? But you know, you see increases in like deaths from like drug abuse over the past year. But it's not just that. It's like kind of like, you know, it's costly to like not be able to see family, see friends, participate in religious and political activity, right? Some countries even banned outdoor activity for some period of time. Like these things are like, the damage to like, cultural institutions and so forth. I mean, it was kind of surprising to me how much people were kind of willing to kind of treat that as like a rounding error. You know what I mean? Because it is kind of harder to measure, I guess, right? If you had some like unit of how much happiness you gain from going out to dinner with your family or something like that, then maybe maybe we could have tried to weigh one thing against another, but like, I don't know.
I think that's part of where the lack of political support came from. These things that were harder to measure were somewhat ignored, at least in the media discussion, I think a lot. And partly because of that, people were like, well, wait, these things matter. So if you're going to ignore those, and that's part of where I think a lot of the West didn't have the political support that some of the Asian countries did, that Australia did, New Zealand did. Now look, Australia and New Zealand are islands, so that's part of why they also had an easier problem set. But when there was a number of countries that managed a lot better than a lot of countries in the West, and so I think, sure, you can look at isolated ones here or there, say, oh, this one had these advantages, this one had an island, but you can also look at like Taiwan and Hong Kong and Japan having so many cases early on and being able to get reasonable control of it. And I think a bit of that comes down to political will, kind of, and some of those it's because there's a little bit different kind of culture around the politics in those countries. But Australia and New Zealand are pretty similar to a lot of the rest of the West, and fine, they have they are islands, but like that was still a somewhat addressable thing, I think, for a lot of the West, if they had tried to do it a bit different and had more of that political discussion of like, here are the two options. But instead it became a lot of a very political problem, at least in America. I don't know as well like in France or something exactly how that argument went down, but at least in the US it became very political, where you had people on the left saying that opening schools was absolutely ridiculous, which like the science says it's somewhat reasonable to consider and maybe should have been happening a lot earlier than it did. And then people on the right saying that wearing a mask took away their freedom, which like probably, at least in public transport, or if we're all going to a Starbucks or something, probably people should have been wearing masks, at least.
No, it's like, I mean, it's totally, and then the vaccines, right? Like, why was the EU trying to nickel and dime these companies to sell to, pay $15 per vaccine instead of $18 or something, right? When like the economic value of vaccines like $2,000 per citizen or something, if you try to calculate it, right? So it's like, it's just totally crazy, right? I don't know if you had poker players running COVID policy, I'm not sure what would have happened. Probably all types of other different types of mistakes, but like, but the kind of getting the order of magnitude right about things, right? That like wearing a mask is like very not costly relative to the benefit it provides, that lockdowns, it's a much more of a debate, that vaccines exceed by 2 orders of magnitude the literal cost you pay for them, right? Like even that would have been helpful.
Right. I think that's something that was missed, this kind of order of magnitude. Even to go on the mask thing, like there were places where everyone was wearing a mask outside, people were 30, 50 feet away, which like the science kind of says you don't really need to be doing. And yet other places where, because I actually traveled a little, I was in Asia for most of COVID, and I traveled a little when I got back, and other places where you would have people in Starbucks and no one was wearing a mask, or like Vegas where and it's like, hey, if you're going to have a 15-minute interaction indoors, like, yeah, masks probably help quite a lot. The amount of viral load you're getting, it probably isn't enough for you to get COVID, especially if both people are wearing masks. But that, all right, if you're outside, it's not as important. These kind of discussions weren't being had, I think, by a lot of the experts. And because they were looking at it saying like, oh, well, if we say people shouldn't wear a mask outside, that might result in a few more COVID cases, which it might. But it also would have probably resulted in a lot less by saying, hey, what really matters is these short 15, 30-minute interactions when you're on a bus, when you're in a Starbucks, something like that. Really then try to have your mask on, because if that person has COVID, you guys might both dodge it. And that's not that big of cost, like wear a mask for 15 minutes. But when people think, oh, you need to wear one 24/7, I had one of my cousins told me he was working a job where he was indoors, had his mask on all day, and he was walking home, and he was like in the middle of the street walking home, and he had taken his mask off. He had been wearing his mask for 8 hours that day. This is in New York. And someone started yelling at him from the restaurant, 10 feet away or whatever. And he probably had slightly different views overall than I did of science, but reasonably close. And I think he was pretty prudent. He had said, he wore his mask all day, and he's like, come on, man, like, what is this? Like, this is some bad science. He's walking past the guy outside for 20 seconds or whatever. Even if he's got COVID and coughs, he's probably not going to give it to anyone, kind of thing. And yet you had people inside in other areas that, like Vegas was an example. I mean, there were tons of people inside, tons of like 60, 70-year-olds inside with no masks on, which I found a bit surprising, because there's also a difference. Like, I had COVID 2 months ago, and it wasn't that pleasant, but it wasn't terrible for me. Like, the people that are
that's the other thing that's like a little, I don't know if it's un-PC to talk about, right? But like the risk of like, and I have friends who have had like long COVID, right? It's a real thing. And, can severely, in one case, a friend, has hurt his quality of life for a year now, getting better now. But it's a real scary thing, right? But still, like, the risk is like much, much, much higher. If you're like over 65, over 75, right? Like, just, orders of magnitude again, higher. And like the advice, like, didn't quite recognize that, right? That I know this really sucks, but if you're age 75, you have to be super fucking careful until the vaccine comes. I'm sorry, right? Or, it's up to you, right?
Or if you're going to see someone that's age 75.
Or if you're seeing someone who's 75, right? And there's some of that, but does the average American know that, like, if you're 75, you're like 500 times more likely to die of COVID than if you're 35 or whatever it is? Because it is like somewhere in that magnitude, even more maybe, right?
75, I think they're roughly 5%. I mean, women less than men, which that was also something that wasn't talked about that much. Women just don't seem to get as bad of a case of COVID as men,
Yeah. Obesity is a big risk factor that I think is that, but like people, you want to have this kind of one size fits all advice, but like, but the message, the honest message is like, actually, this is about protecting grandma, right? It's not that like, if you're 35, you're going to probably have that severe case, that we have to be careful with long COVID and whatnot. It is mostly about the fact that you transmit it on average to 2 other people if you're not taking precautions. And one of those 2 might be someone who would die from it, right? And so we kind of, I don't know. We were kind of like, people, if you look at survey data, actually overestimate their own personal risk in a perverse way that might have worked out okay, because like there's an externality to your risk, right? But it also meant that, like, just kind of why things were weird, right? We're telling like a lot of like little mistruths to people, or kind of in what points you emphasize and which ones you don't. When you kind of say, well, anyone can technically get a severe case of COVID and die, that's true, but there's much more age dependence and some other conditions than the average person thinks. And so I don't know.
So someone had said something recently about like, I don't know where I saw this, but if you're 30, if you're 40, and 1 year of your life you live locked down, like, you can bounce back reasonably well. That's 1 out of 30 years or 1 out of 40 years. And if you're 7 and you live a year locked down, that's going to be a lot harder to bounce back. That's 1 out of 8 years.
I tweeted that, I think. Yeah. If you're like, and I don't have kids, but like, if you're like, I would be, if I did have like a 7-year-old kid, I would be like terrified. Well, first of all, if I were a parent and I have a 7-year-old kid, then I would read the science, and the science would say that like 7-year-old kids are not going to get sick very often, and they probably don't transmit that well, right? And therefore, my kid would have been allowed to like have some play dates, right? And I would have sought out a school that was open, right? And I would have been careful, but if you have one of these parents who's like has shut their kid out of society for a year.
Well, there's one major downside. I can be the authority here. So Bear, age 7, thrived through COVID. He had a fantastic year. My daughter, Amelia, who's almost 10, she had a good year, and by her own admission, enjoyed quarantine. She liked remote learning and liked being at home. However, I noticed for Amelia and many other kids Amelia's age that the long time on screens had some adverse consequences. We accelerated screen addiction for this younger generation, and I think that will have some cost for quite a while.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks people are going to like rebel against it too and become like.
No, that's not the way it works for kids. For kids, their natural temperament is calm. They want to be outdoors. They have a very long attention span, and there's some things that they naturally gravitate to that is like long play, where they will write stories or tell stories or build stuff with Legos or play some fantasy game. And it will require a lot of long attention. And this is naturally what they do. But then when they have screens enter their life, it becomes a one-way street of distraction, and they don't go back to long play. And that, like, every parent observes this. And so screen addiction is kind of a one-way street, and you don't want to bring it into your kid's life earlier. And I'm afraid that COVID did this for a whole generation. Got them on screens much earlier than they otherwise would have been. And there's the kids do not say. Adults might say, well, I spent 4 hours a day on my iPhone this year. That's way too much. I'm gonna put it away and make sure I'm more deliberate with my time. No kid is saying, oh, I spent way too much time on my iPad or way too much time on Nintendo this year. I'm gonna be outside all next year. It's just not the way their brains work. Screen addiction is a little bit of a one-way street. So Nate, in New York, you might have a poker player determining policy, a poker player and a data guy. Is it true that Andrew Yang is the favorite to be mayor of New York?
He's a poker player?
I think so.
Yeah. I
mean, he likes little constituencies, right? So he kind of talks about online poker and stuff like that. Yeah, I think Yang is the favorite. He's ahead in the polls. Historically, kind of ahead in the polls at this point, is probably going to win, half the time or something like that. One thing about like mayoral candidates in New York is that they tend to be like very kind of provincial New York. Well, maybe not all of them. I mean, like most of the mayoral candidates are like kind of provincial New York politicians. And like the weird thing about New York is like the average New Yorker doesn't think that much about like New York politics necessarily. Like our turnout tends to be very low in like mayoral elections,
like low teens or even like close to 10, because primary determines everything, right? So
currently it seems very unlikely that a Republican would win the mayorship of New York. So it's basically the primary. Yeah. But yeah, the turnout's quite low. And Yang is someone who appeals to people who, maybe not appeals, but is known by people who follow national politics, right? He's kind of got like a name brand, name recognition, right? People are like, well, he's only doing the polls because of name recognition. Well, that matters in real life too, right? If people are like, oh, yeah, he's into math and will be New York City's first Asian American mayor, and he kind of seems like a goofy but kind of regular guy, like, that like appeals to like a decent number of people. If a lot of other people are kind of apathetic, and so but he comes across as being very relatable. Now, the flip side of that is like people in New York City who like are very into politics might say, well, Yang, I don't trust his experience, right? His position on X and Y doesn't quite land right for me, right? I think he's kind of being hokey by visiting all these like bodegas and stuff like that. But like, being seen as like a normal guy is a strategy that kind of works pretty well in politics, right? It kind of worked for Joe Biden. It worked in a different way for Donald Trump, right? It worked for Barack Obama in a somewhat different way, right? But he's seen as like kind of a relatable guy, as like kind of a classic political play. I'm not sure how much of that is like his team of advisors versus like just kind of who he is naturally. But yeah, I'm going to be interviewing him for at the Sloan conference, actually, the virtual Sloan conference. So I'm thinking about like, and I'm going to ask him some tough questions because I'm a New York City resident, right? And I feel my job as a journalist is to grill him on a few things. But I think he's the favorite. Yeah.
So Nate, I have a question for you, something I've thought about a bit before, and it's like a theory I have that could just be way off, but I'm guessing you guys have both know a little bit about like decision fatigue, right?
Sure.
Basically, in your brain, when you use your brain more than a certain amount, especially in one area, maybe you have a little less bandwidth to focus. And I think if you look at someone now compared to the average person, say 50 years ago, you're receiving more information, you're using your brain more, and you're probably getting a lot more headlines and stuff and less substance. And I suspect that the power of like memes or something like that is basically trending up and up politically. And the power of that, basically whoever the kind of political experts thought was the better candidate 3 months out in 1970 was probably more likely to win because people would get to the same conclusion they did more often because they would think about it more. And now I think there might be less kind of mental space that each person's giving to those decisions in a lot of cases, especially when they don't think it matters that much. And something like a New York City mayoral election, I think might be the kind of case that a lot of constituents are like, okay, this doesn't matter that much. Whether that's true or not, I'm saying that might just be their belief and they might not give it as much space as someone 50 years ago would have.
I think there is something to that. I mean, I think it's also like, it used to be that like political journalists or just journalists in general was kind of seen as a working class profession, right? And kind of select people from different parts of the society. And now it's kind of, although it still often pays, frankly, like working class wages, overwhelmingly journalists are like college educated, usually from very elite schools and live in big cities and have networks of other kind of highly educated people. And that influences things quite a lot, right? Like the average like political journalist, all their friends were voting for like Elizabeth Warren, and they might not know any kind of Joe Biden voters personally. But yeah, Joe Biden voters were largely college or non-college educated, older, Black or Hispanic a lot of the time, right? I mean, he won by a fairly big margin in the primary. And so yeah, I mean, I think like kind of like reporters are kind of more detached from the average person at the same time that education's become a better predictor of like, of success, right? And I think in particular, like reporters understand that they don't understand how like Trump voters think, right? So for a Trump voter, they'll go and like do reporting or look at polls or whatever else, right? But reporters think they know how like the average Democrat thinks, and they're actually kind of further removal than you might think, between kind of someone who is thinking about politics as a reporter 24/7 and someone who's a liberal, a Democrat, but works as a lawyer or something and is just trying to like live their life and devotes, like you said, like 20 minutes total to thinking about the New York mayor's race, but enough to vote, right? And there are a lot of people like that. And I don't think I don't think reporters get that necessarily.
I would say there are two things. You have decision fatigue, and then you have attention span. And it's evident that everyone's attention span has been decimated by modern technology. And I think that explains the importance of memes. Decision fatigue, I think of as like the air traffic controller who's actually quite good at focusing on what they're doing, but on hour 8 or 9 of the job, they aren't able to perform as effectively. Or like the pilot who's a great pilot, but he's typically quite focused, and then at the end of a shift, he's not focused. And
well, I think that's the clearest place to find it. But do you think that means it's not there? I think it still might be there a little bit in this other area. And if it's only there a little bit, but in a huge segment of the population, that can influence elections.
I guess the deeper question there is is the modern short attention span driven by basically decision fatigue, as you call it? Like we have too much coming in and we're exhausted, or is it driven by like the dopamine engine in the brain that's just overstimulated and we're just like little rats pressing that lever trying to get some more dopamine? It seems like the evidence suggests it's more driven by the dopamine pathway, and that has kept our attention spans extremely short and leads to the importance of memes.
My guess is it's both, and that it's the dopamine one more, like you're saying. But I think that dopamine pathway part is something that political science and stuff has a little bit of an idea of, right? Okay, who's got more clicks, who's got more followers, this kind of like, both sides can compete on the messaging there a bit. But I think this idea of, are people taking as deep a dive as they used to, which I suspect in something like a presidential race, I think they might be taking almost as deep a dive as they used to. But in a lot of like local, elections and stuff, I think people might be doing that a lot less. I'm not sure. It's just my guess.
Well, for sure, they're doing it a lot less. I can say because when Rod's wife was running for city council and I was helping out with the campaign, you would actually chat with the voters and you would realize how little they knew about the candidates. It was quite disconcerting, especially because Rod's wife would have won any election where people cared deeply and really examined it. But yeah, what the actual voter behavior, it seemed to me, was driven by endorsements a lot of the time, like, or the last person that the voter talked with.
Or like, if you're not spending much time on something, you're like, okay, the New York Times endorsed her opponent, and I'm in Manhattan, I'm a liberal, I read the New York Times dutifully, right? I'm going to go with the New York Times. I have a good reason not to. So those endorsements are like very powerful in kind of low information environments.
I noticed that a lot of voters would just carry the paper into the voting booth and just go down the line with endorsements, which,
whoa.
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's a corruptible process, right? If people know that, then they can game the endorsement procedure. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but presumably it's gameable like anything else.
I've heard one thing which I find interesting, and I think is probably true, that people on the right in America understand how people on the left thinks better than people on the left understand how people on the right think. To me, that seems pretty true.
I think that's true in the sense of like, people on the right are kind of, I mean, they're not a minority, right? It's kind of, maybe they technically are, but like, 48-52 or whatever, right? But like, I think they're used to like being kind of seen as outsiders relative to mainstream culture, because like pop culture is kind of, if it's like the fourth branch of society, I mean, that is kind of permanently won by the left, you know what I mean? And so you kind of have to, I think, push back on that a little bit more. I mean, yeah, I know I will not get myself in too much trouble on this podcast, hopefully. But yeah, I think increasingly like liberals do not understand when they're being partisan, and people on the right also don't understand it, but kind of have like a mildly better instinct for like when they're making a partisan argument versus, you know what I mean? Yeah, you kind of see it on some of this like trust the science stuff, where like at one point, trust the science meant don't wear masks, right? At one point, trust the science meant, no, we can't open schools. And so, I mean, that's just the kind of thing where like, actually, like, first of all, this isn't science, this is public policy, which should be informed by science, we would hope, right? But that kind of like sloganeering, I think, is something that is usually a bad sign. But I think it's also kind of relatively recent, right? I mean, it is like a little bit like the Trump thing on COVID, where like Trump was so terrible about COVID that like it kind of rationalized everyone else being kind of lazy and terrible too, even if they weren't as terrible, or if their intentions were certainly much better, right? Or they were trying harder. All those things are important, but like, but I think a lot of liberals are like, well, Trump was so uniquely terrible, which, I don't know if I would, I think the stuff that happened around January 6th or whatever, right, was terrifying, and many things about his presidency, right? But it stopped people's self-critique a little bit in some sense. And if people aren't self-critical, then they'll make worse decisions. And also decision fatigue is a thing too. Just the fact that obviously I am covering politics for a living, at least is one of the major things that I do, right? Just like the fact that the constant news that Trump would create, and the waking up at 6 a.m., he's tweeted something totally outlandish and it dictates the news cycle for the day. And then there's 3 huge news stories every day, right? That creates a huge amount of decision fatigue, I think, for anyone, not just people who are covering politics, right? And then kind of in the pandemic, we're now I have to fucking think about if I want to go to dinner, I want to go outdoors. Is this place outdoors enough? It's kind of in a tent or something like that. And how do I feel about inviting my friend? Maybe, someone's been vaccinated, someone hasn't been, right? And it just it just kind of becomes exhausting after a period of time.
I have a question about state and local government politics. I think one of the subtle things that has happened during COVID is that we've had a blending of federal, state, local government finance. For a long time, states and local governments sort of stood on their own for budgetary matters. Occasionally, there would be a federal bailout, but in COVID, we've had a situation where state and local governments are often running at a extreme deficit, and the federal government has bailed out state and local governments, but there's the possibility that it will be an ongoing there will be demand for it to be ongoing, and it might sort of alter the relationship of the federal government with the states. And then as it relates to, say, the three of us, I've been in Miami for a long while. You guys are, well, Tom, you're currently in California, not full-time in California, and Nate, you're in New York. It's interesting that we have this sort of antiquated residence system for the states where if you're there over 6 months, you're a resident. If you're there 3 months, you're not a resident. And you have Florida basically free riding on the states of New York and California, and having everyone come to Florida and decimate the tax base in California and New York. It seems like a long-term issue. How might you see that playing out, Nate? I was surprised because I did a fundraising chat with Andrew Yang recently, and I haven't been to New York in 18 months. The picture that he was painting was quite dire. I was a bit surprised, and it was not really Andrew Yang painting the picture. It was the other people on the call asking questions. It was evident that they thought New York was in a troubled state.
As someone who's in New York, I'm thinking about the fiscal policy, right? In terms New York, if you have not been in New York in 18 months, then New York is much livelier than you would think, right? People are not super paranoid, right? All the outdoor dining setups give the city a lot of life, right? And this is more recent, right? Lots of people in Central Park and stuff like that. But yeah, the fiscal policy, I don't know, right? You have people moving, you certainly are going to have a reduction in people working at offices in Midtown, whether that's semi-permanent or very permanent or short term, I don't know, right? You have people moving out of the city into the suburbs. Suburbs are some which are not, by the way, located in New York State. So yeah, it's going to be a problem. I think one thing you might also see is that as work from home becomes more acceptable for more kind of people in high income professions, you'll see people who are more nomadic, right? You have a place in Miami and you have a place if you're wealthy in New York City. And of course you're going to be in the Miami place, 190 days a year. So you're in the New York place less than 183 or whatever it is. And Yeah, I mean, I think this could be an issue for sure. Like which places are winners and losers of like these shifts? Like in the long run, I don't know. I mean, I think in the long run, New York will be fine because we have a lot of different industries, and it's always been kind of a city where people kind of select to live, right? I'd worry like a bit more about like a city like Seattle, which is a nice place to live, but it's kind of cold and rainy, and like, you know, if you didn't have those couple of major companies there, it would not be the economy that is. But I don't know. I mean, but also the various like bailout packages were quite generous, I think, and so you haven't had as many budgetary problems as people were necessarily afraid of. But could New York City have problems? Potentially, sure. Will they try to claw that back by like having people who, maybe now if my company is based in New York, even if I'm living outside of New York, then you're going to try to tax me, right? Maybe now if I'm in New York for any number of days of the year, then, which is probably how it should be. You know what I mean? I mean, there shouldn't be some like magic threshold at 183, 184 days. It should be kind of a sliding scale probably anyway. I mean, I've had to pay taxes in California some years where I was going there enough for work where like they do actually do that. They do make you pay taxes if you're there more than like 14 days a year for a work related purpose, I think actually. So yeah.
My long-term plan is after Amelia and Bear graduate high school, I'm going to talk them into relocating to Tokyo.
Oh shit.
Oh,
Tokyo is fantastic. We've been to Tokyo together.
Tom, when Nate and I were in Tokyo, John Yuanda took us out, and that was our best night of the whole trip.
yeah, I want to go to Tokyo, have John Dwan to take me around. I think he knows all the spots.
Bear really wants to go to Japan because Nintendo World was scheduled to open just before COVID hit, and they never did the grand opening. I'm pretty sure they still haven't opened it, but Nintendo World is supposed to be like Disney times 10 and all Nintendo. Bear really wants to go. So Tom, do you see yourself staying in the States for the rest of the calendar year?
Not trying to predict what's going to happen for the rest of this calendar year. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a weird world we're living in right now. So I'll be here for the near future, and we'll see after that. But
yeah, Tom is different than most poker players because most poker players, when they venture outside their sphere, they're like everyone else in that they demonstrate extreme overconfidence. Tom really doesn't have overconfidence outside his sphere. Wouldn't you say that it's probably the most persistent behavioral anomaly that almost everyone demonstrates extreme overconfidence? I think it's probably the most interesting part of financial markets, at least when you get into those chapters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like kind of, I mean, even being told that they're overconfident, people kind of remain overconfident. It's kind of very hard to coax out of people. I'm sure that I have like a lot of it too. One good thing about poker is you don't really actually hit the long run in the poker that fast at all. I don't know. I mean, that kind of one question to explore too is like how many people are actually really making a good living over the long term from just their poker winnings and losings, right? Is that like 100 people in the world, 1,000, 10,000? I don't. It's not that many.
Well, you get so much regime change.
2011.
Of course, yeah.
It was a lot back then. Now I'm sure it's gotten down, but I would still take the over on 10,000. I think probably by a lot.
On 10,000 people.
Yeah.
Currently making their living in poker.
Yeah.
Defined as sustainable. Their expected value is like at least at the median income of their country, and
or
they're
like not that far off, kind of thing. Yeah.
I would take the under on that one personally, but
I mean, there's a lot of those Asian countries that have just a bunch of live games running all the time.
Yeah.
Macau, Philippines, like I don't know. I mean, I know there was like I never went there, but there was that Sikanoville in Cambodia. There's there's a bunch of these Singapore. There's just a lot of people those places, and then there's online in a lot of different places. I mean, I think over 10,000.
Have you been playing much time apart from high stakes poker?
No, I haven't played live since then.
So Nate, for the book, how much of it will be field research? Can we expect that you'll be at the World Series of Poker this year?
Oh, for sure. I mean, because like, just like I do enjoy playing poker, but yeah, I mean, I want to be on the scene. I want to talk to people. I mean, there are lots of people to talk to in Vegas. So yeah, I mean, even in like a normal non-book year, right? Like I kind of really missed, I'd started to actually like play more live poker like 2 and 3 years ago. It's something that kind of had not been my life for a while. I'm like, actually, it's kind of fun to like go to like 6 tournaments a year, try to take it seriously. But yeah, so I'm excited to go to the World Series, because now is going to be in September through November. Probably going to hit up
next try,
try maybe, yeah.
Yeah, you should come to the next one we have. Yeah.
Where is it? It's in Macau, or
unsure for now, but
no, I will. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't play in that.
Usually it's a few places. Some Macau, some Jeju. I mean, Macau we actually never had one yet. We were gonna have one now. Jeju, Montenegro, London, but I'll let you know.
I'm going to the WPT Hard Rock Seminole, I guess, later this month. I'll be fully vaccinated by the time that happens, so I'll feel not super guilty about playing live poker the first time in a year. So it'll be good.
What else will be part of the field research program?
I mean, I have some like really weird esoteric things I want to do. Like I want to study people who take like extreme risks, like people who are like doing like extreme like rock climbing and stuff like that. I do not think I'm going to go like mountain climbing or rock climbing with them, but like that's something where I'm just kind of interested in, right? I know there's something like kind of NFT related I can do potentially. I need to meet some DFS players. They tend to be like, at least poker players, right? They're on TV. Frankly, I kind of like have some idea of who the people who are more interesting characters from a book standpoint might be, or might have more unique perspectives. I might have to hit you up, Brandon, for like, who is a DFS player who would actually be interesting for like readers to meet, and maybe you're like sweating an NFL Sunday with them or something, right?
Yeah, Empire or Osimo is an entertaining cat. I think he's been rated the top tournament player for 3 years. US
Open, maybe. I hope you're coming this year, Brandon. But I'm going to probably write. I think tennis is like one of the better sports for writing about in the sports betting chapter. So
I will be there. Excellent. Well, guys, thanks so much. This was a really fun podcast. I expect that it will be popular with the viewers. Hopefully we can do a round 2 in a year or so.
For sure.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right. Later, guys.
See you, man. See you guys.